Renatus the Ursarius, a book excerpt by Joe B. Author, Joe B. This book is published on Amazon's Kindle Vella. Chapter 1. The sun was hot, but there was a cool breeze coming down from the mountains. Caelius plopped himself down in his portable folding chair under some palm trees and watched the progress. His team had captured 2 more giraffes, and the huge cages were slowly being raised by 3 men in a giant wheel, slowly climbing inside the wheel. The wheel pulled a cable that ran through some pulleys at the top of a tower. The pulleys slowly raised the cage with the poor disoriented giraffe inside. More slaves then rotated the wheel and tower so the raised cage could be lowered onto the barge. The barge would be ready to leave soon. They had carefully balanced the load, which was why his men had hunted down 2 giraffes. The beasts joined 3 leopards and 2 lions. The hippos would be loaded onto the next barge. Those beasts were just too heavy. Caelius had noted the owner of the barges had brought along his son for the spectacle. He saw him coming to talk to him before they began the long journey down the Nile to the port to offload the cages onto galleys that would sail on to Rome. The owner of the barges was named Paulus. He was descended from Phoenicians who used to have a district assigned to them in Alexandria. The Phoenicians disappeared a long time ago, but Paulus's family stayed. It was good to be friendly with Paulus. This was the way Egyptians did business. If you did not smile and play friends with them, they would pack up and take their business elsewhere. It seemed disingenuous to Romans, but this is the way business was done here, and Caelius was growing fat and wealthy with this business. He was certainly going to do his part. Paulus introduced his son to Caelius and thanked him for hiring his barges. Paulus had been involved with grain shipments almost exclusively, and although he had seen many barges carrying wild animals before, this was the first time his barges had been contracted to provide this service. Paulus loved seeing the wild animals up close, and his son was clearly fascinated by the lions, leopards, hippos, and giraffes. Paulus finally asked the question Caelius had been expecting for some time. "Caelius, I'm so curious. How is it you became involved with this business, this commodity?" Caelius sighed, for this wasn't the first time he'd told the tale. It was an unusual business specialty, though, and he'd gotten used to the question. He took a breath and leaned back in his chair and began. Caelius had been in the legions for 22 years. He traveled the world in that time, from Britannia to the Exinios Pontus. It was escorting a diplomatic mission to Olbia, on the shores of the Exinios Pontus, that Caelius had met a pair of hunters who had brought a large captured bear in a cage to their king. They'd been expected some days earlier, and the king scolded them on their timing. The bear had been meant as a gift for the Roman diplomats. The diplomats accepted the bear and were very pleased, but Caelius had studied the hunters who had brought the bear. They did not seem like ordinary hunters. Their knuckles were hardened, and the way they carried themselves, the way they studied him, made Caelius believe these were actually warriors who hunted for sport, not professional hunters. Years later, on campaign in Macedonia, a slave caravan was making its way past his post when Caelius heard someone calling him by name from the wagons. Caelius grew curious and made his way to the wagons. There he saw one of the hunters from that meeting with the Scythian king in Olbia. He'd been captured in battle. He addressed Caelius directly and told him he knew Romans enjoyed spectacles where wild animals were slaughtered for sport in huge arenas. "Free me, and I will make us both rich," the captured warrior promised. Caelius explained to Paulus, this kind of attitude strikes at the heart of a Roman. Romans love audacity. Romans also love an original idea. This captured man had nothing to give, absolutely nothing, which made his offer all the more appealing. "This was not the man talking, you understand," Caelius explained to Paulus, "but the gods speaking through this man. Once you understand this, you understand Romans. Paulus nodded, seeing the fruits of this promise laid out before his eyes. Clearly this man had grown wealthy, very wealthy in fact, allowing this young Scythian warrior to catch beasts for him. "Did you come to Egypt immediately?" he asked Caelius. "No," Caelius explained. "At first we went to Bactria, hunting leopards and bears in the mountains. We were lucky to catch 2 in a week. Then one of our shipping merchants told me he knew of a wealthy man in Egypt who had been selling wild animals to the Romans, who had been robbed and murdered. The wild animals were no longer being sold from that port in Egypt, and it had been very busy for a generation in the trade of wild animals. I took note, and Renatus agreed we should investigate. We came upriver and found this station, these docks, unused and abandoned. Renatus and his cousins traveled into the mountains, and found their way into the jungles beyond, and here we are." "Renatus is a Roman name, not Scythian?" Paulus inquired. "Renatus means born again in Latin," Caelius explained. "Once I bought his freedom and the freedom of 2 of his cousins. He chose that name for his new life." Paulus nodded. It was a good name. This land was far from Scythia and Bactria. He imagined the Scythian warriors were indeed living a second life here, far removed from their proud memories on the Scythian plains. Chapter 2. While Paulus was listening to Caelius describe the difficulties the Scythians were having with the local climate and diet, he noticed his son was growing bored. "We really must be going, my friend Caelius," Paulus interrupted, noticing the cages were being secured to the barge. "We will return next week for the next load." Suddenly a rider broke through the edge of the forest, riding at a gallop. He hurriedly stopped his horse just shy of Caelius and leapt off the horse. "I'm sorry to interrupt you, my lord Caelius, but Renatus urges you to come at once." What is this?" asked Caelius, a little angry at his leisurely break being so rudely interrupted. Caelius then remembered his friend Paulus, and kissed both cheeks before allowing him to exit in a proper and formally acceptable manner, according to the local customs. The 2 men chatted for a few more words, before Paulus turned and nodded to the messenger, and then began walking back down the hill towards where his son was waiting. "What is this?" Caelius asked again, a little angry and confused. "Renatus has found a beast, an unusual beast, something very big and very strong. There is something unusual about this beast. It has broken the cages and killed 2 of the horses. Renatus has gone riding after it, tracking it. His cousins are getting new horses and preparing to follow. One of them is waiting for you. Renatus says this will make you all a fortune. You must come see this beast. All the native guides have fled. They called the beast Imele Notuga and ran in all directions, screaming." Caelius began walking towards his tent. He still kept his sword and helmet in memory of his legionary days. He donned them and whistled for his servant to bring him his horse. He quickly mounted and began shouting directions at the servants. He needed them to keep guard over the camp. The barges would return in a week, and they needed to load the hippos. If they did not return, make sure to get the payment recorded for the giraffes and lions. He would look for the payment when he returned. The hippos would be a suitable load for the next week's shipment if he did not return by then. He steered his horse back to camp and directed 3 of his staff to move his tent to the hunting camp and wait for him there if they did not return in time for next week's shipment. The staff saluted him, and he rode off, looking for the messenger to guide him back down to the Scythian camp. The messenger found him, and the 2 galloped off down the trail. "By the gods, my lord," the messenger shouted at him as they rode, "if we can capture this beast, it will be the talk of Rome for years." "You saw it?" Caelius shouted back as they dashed up the hill towards the mountains. "I saw it from a distance, my lord. It is a very great beast indeed, as big as an elephant, with huge spear-like horns on its head. And it is fast, my lord, very fast and fierce." Caelius immediately began thinking, how could they trap such a beast and safely cage it for transport? This beast, if the messenger was accurate, would make them a fortune indeed. The trail went up the mountain and began a descent down the far side where the jungle began. The jungle was thick, but a wide road had been made through much of it, from hunters shipping wild beasts to Rome for the past 100 years. The two were able to gallop through much of it for the next hour, until the horses began to tire. It was at this point that the Scythians had made their hunting camp. One thing Scythians know well is the distance a horse can safely travel at a gallop. They always made some sort of station at regular intervals, so horses could be rested and, if a true emergency arose, hastily exchanged with fresh horses waiting at the next station. It was mobility like this that kept the Scythians a free people despite hundreds of years of living next to the growing and hungry Roman Empire. Their people ranged throughout all the vast plains around the Euxinius Pontus, extending all the way to the icy seas in the far north, or so their stories told. Callias had learned to believe them. Everything Renatus had told him, so far, had turned out to be the truth. Once they arrived at the hunting camp, Renatus's cousin, Ixtus, was mounted and waiting. "What is this, Ixtus? What is Renatus hunting?" Callias asked, dismounting, stretching his legs and back, and walking to a jug sitting on a table beside a nearby tent to grab a little refreshment. "You're going to like this, my lord," Ixtus replied. Callias drank a little watered wine and looked up at him. "Is it big?" "It is big," Ixtus smiled and nodded. He gestured to his left, and Callias turned to see. One of the servants was bringing a tall black stallion. Callias was pleased. This animal was born to run. He loved the way these Scythians knew horses. "Let's ride, Ixtus," he said, feeling the hot blood of his legionary days returning. He took a moment to better secure his helmet, leaned forward, gripping the belly of his horse with his legs, and leaped into a full gallop. Ixtus effortlessly caught up to him and joined him. The two rode side by side wordlessly. The forest opened up, and Ixtus made a gesture. Callias saw the track and followed it. The trail of galloping horses and a large beast with elephant-like feet was leading through a wide clearing in the forest canopy down a steep hill towards their left. Callias noticed branches had been cut, likely Renatus or someone with him, taking swipes at the branches as they galloped, marking their trail. At the bottom of the hill, Callias saw smoke. Renatus had made a camp. The sun was getting low. The beast they were following was mighty indeed, but not too bright. The trail was obvious. Callias was sorry he had not been able to see the wrecked traps the animal had likely escaped from. He needed to know more about what it was they would be facing. He felt optimistic that Renatus would have the answers for him at the camp. Callias slowed his horse. A familiar smell was hitting him as he neared the encampment. Renatus was cooking goat, or perhaps the group had caught some local deer. Callias was happy. He felt sure the Scythians had brought wine along as well. He was never surprised anymore at what they were able to carry on horse, with no saddle, at a full gallop, riding for a full day. These people had lived on horseback, and they lived well. For the rest of the story, look for Renatus the Ursarius on Amazon's Kindle Vella. Thank you.